What do you do when your table at an event is bursting with sci-fi, fantasy, and a live Kickstarter, but everyone keeps asking for middle grade books? Welcome to The Truth About Storytelling, the podcast that pulls back the curtain on how words become worlds. I'm Tyrean Martinson, fantasy and sci-fi author, lifelong poet, and former teacher. Here, we trade shiny book blurbs for honest craft talk, the sparks, the stumbles, and the sacred ordinary moments every writer faces. If you're here to grow your voice on the page or in a poem, you're in the right place. Let's write brave stories together. So this week, we are going to be talking about lessons from Realm Makers, what I learned from having my books at a table in the expo hall, and also taking another sneak peek at To Speak poems for Inspired Courage, Wild Grace, and Sacred Ordinary, which I'll have a special episode for on Friday. Three main things I learned from my time at Realm Makers Expo this last weekend are all around presentation. So the first lesson is all about brand cohesion, beating genre chaos. So I am the kind of person who is like genre chaotic positive. I love to write in more than one world. I love to have different ideas going, but when visitors stop by your table or walk by their table, they basically decide in 3 seconds or less if your table is for them. So an overarching theme, color scheme, imagery, or brand that can anchor multiple genres is a really good idea. So mismatched signage can cause misconnections. But for me, it feels a little bit deeper than that because I worked at creating signs that kind of matched each other, but also showed that I had different genres on the table. I had signs for my fantasy, I had signs for my sci-fi, I had signs for my short stories, I had a sign for my poetry Kickstarter, I had a sign for my upcoming Mongolia mission. If you can tell, I had a lot of things on my table, right? Plus, I had a sign that talked about how everything was set up and what things cost. And I tried to make everything very clear. And I think that helped. I noticed people actually looking at the signs and many people veering toward the area that they really liked. Like if they liked fantasy, they went directly to the fantasy. If they wanted sci-fi, they went to the sci-fi. So there was signage with, again, the same type of font for all the signs, but different colors and set near the books that they would go with. And I think that did really help me. But I noticed when I stood back and looked at my table, I have a lot of different color schemes going on with my books. In some ways, that's a strength because you can definitely tell which ones are fantasy and which ones are sci-fi. But in other ways, it's not because it feels a little bit like the whole table doesn't quite go together. And sometimes I get asked, oh, did you write these? And they'd point at the sci-fi books, or these, and they'd point at the fantasy books, even though my name is displayed on both covers. So I am taking a long, hard look at all of my imagery and all of the colors I use on my website and on my book covers, and it's going to take a little while, but I plan to do a reset of some kind to kind of tie everything all together in a way that is visually understandable and have a main brand that really anchors the message behind most of my books. So that way people know what it's about when they walk up. While I was at Realm Makers Expo, I saw authors who did this really, really well. They had very clear signage for their entire brand, often with a key phrase written on one of their larger backdrop posters or pieces that they showed out front with everything or behind them with everything. And that very clearly written, like one phrase or 3 words, tied all of their stuff together, even if they wrote in different genres. And then often they had kind of a color scheme going for their books. So they had all cool colors or all warm colors. And regardless of which genre they were writing in. And I think that really helped people understand what they were selling, and that all of their books, even if they were in different worlds or different genres, that they all came from the same person. So I've really been thinking about that, and I don't know that I'm going to get it all perfect anytime soon. Probably not. But I've been thinking about what that means for me next year. Probably not this year. I'm not going to change all my book covers this year. It might actually take me a couple years, but I will be going through and figuring out how I can add elements, at least, to my book covers to tie everything together. And I feel like, basically for me, it showed me that my brand name needs an audit. And I've never really liked the idea of a brand name. I picture actually like a cow brand being like chiseled into the flesh of a cow, and I don't want that, right? I don't want a brand to put on me like that. But being an eclectic author isn't enough of a brand that people understand what that means. I would say that I always write stories about reluctant heroes. I write stories where there's a need for courage and a character who struggles with either doubt or fear or anger, and they have to work their way through it. There's always an internal struggle that goes with the external struggle of what they're going through, but that could be said of almost every book out there, right? So I need to figure out exactly what my phrase is that goes across all of my books, regardless of whether they're fantasy, sci-fi, poetry, short stories, or anything else I might write. So that's something that I'm really working on right now, and it's something I'm going to be kind of working on for quite a while until I get it all figured out. One of the tables across from me in the aisle was for Ember's Ignite Editing, and I have to say their brand was just on point. Like, everything went together. Everything they had on their table made sense. It was just beautifully done, and I understood what they were providing as a service, and again, everything made sense together. So I've been really thinking about how I can do that. So the second lesson, can you believe it? That was all one lesson. The second lesson kind of goes with the first one, in that expectations and takeaways matter. So clear price markers and what's this about signage really matters. And I did have signage, and that, I think, really helped me. I had a clear price marker. I think that also helped. There were definitely people who were on a budget, and I think some people bought my sci-fi books because they wanted sci-fi books, and some people bought a few of my sci-fi or short story books because they were the lower price books on the table. So I think it's actually a really good idea to have a price range of things on our tables when we're at book events. Everything from like cheap and free type stuff, I didn't have enough of that, to mid-range chapbooks, to full price paperbacks, maybe even some small swag type items that swag usually means free, but small items that we can sell. Like, I had poem cards that I was trying to sell, and I did have someone buy 2 of them. That was very nice, but a lot of people wanted them for free, and that was a bit of a sticker for me. So that was a struggle. I go back and forth. I'm like, should I have just given them away? And then I'm like, no, I really want to sell them kind of as a support for my Kickstarter campaign for my poetry book. Yeah, I'm not sure how well that went. But anyway, I did try to have different entry points for people, so that way someone didn't have to like fork over a lot of money if they wanted to support me as an author. So I think it's a really good idea to have a different variation like that. However, I did see a few people do really, really well who didn't have that. There was a gentleman next to me. He had 2 books out. They had the most gorgeous cover art. He had a fantasy map for his world sitting center in the table, along with some purple, I think 3D printed like little rocks that went with the fantasy map and went with the world, and they were kind of scattered around the table and artistically. And that was the main thing. Oh, wait, no, he had 2 signs that were standing up. One had a QR code for his website and newsletter, and the other had 2 QR codes for 2 free short stories. And people loved that. They loved being able to click that QR code, go away and read his story. And many of those people, they read his short story and they came back later and bought books. And so I was very impressed by that. So I guess you could say he did have 2 entry levels to get in. He had the free short stories that people could, again, they could use the QR code, read the short story online for free, and then come back and buy one of the books that was set in the same world as the short stories. So he had a very clear through line for what he was doing, very clear branding, clear color scheme. Everything was very clear. And again, he had 2 kind of entry points. He had the books, which they're pretty big fantasy books, and he had the free short stories. But again, a lot of people really loved those free short stories via QR codes. And I'm thinking that I would like to try to do that the next time I have a table, to have QR codes on a sign for a couple of free short stories that would take people, one for my fantasy world and one for my sci-fi world. So that way they have a clear entry point into one of those 2 series. And then maybe, I don't know, maybe 1 free poem that they would then hopefully use as a way to enter into my poetry. So those are my ideas at this point, based on what I've learned. Another thing I learned is that there was a little bit of bulking at higher priced items. Again, I did see the gentleman next to me sell some really nice, fairly expensive paperback and hardback books that were hugely thick fantasy books. But for the most part, people were kind of balking at spending more than $10 or $12 on a book by an author they didn't know. I think the reason the gentleman next to me was able to sell the ones he did sell is because he had those free short stories that people could scan QR code for, go off and read, and then come back and buy one of his books. And authors at this huge author event, we all had very different price points. Prices ranged anywhere from $8, not very many books were priced that, and they were usually novella size type books, from $8 to $30 for paperback books, with some hardbacks in the $35 to $40 range. And there were a lot of people there who felt like, well, they were on a budget and they weren't quite sure how many books they could buy, and they weren't sure how much money they had to spend. And so those higher price point books struggled to sell, I think, for a lot of people. And if that's all anyone had on their table, they really struggled. I saw some people who had some gorgeous books that I think were definitely great to read. They were struggling to sell, and I think it's because they didn't have a less expensive option to kind of start people off with. That's my opinion. I could be wrong. Having different price points really makes a difference. And sometimes people, when they come to an event, especially if it's a huge book sale event where there's just tons of books there, they're looking in a way sometimes for bargains, or can they get, 3 for the price of 2.5, or those types of things. So author kind of down the row from me, she had 3 novellas and 2 novels that were all put together in an omnibus edition, and that omnibus edition was $32. And if you'd bought all the little individual pieces of everything else, it was going to be, I think, $50. And so she had kind of a bargain omnibus option, and people really liked that. So I think that really helped her as well. And she also had a variety of books, but again, they shared the same color tone or the same color family. And so I think that helped with her presentation. And again, clearly marked prices and things like that. Okay, one bonus thing I learned, and this may not apply for everyone. In fact, not all of this is going to apply for everyone because every event is slightly different. Every crowd of people who comes to an event is slightly different. So you have to kind of take all this with a grain of salt, or knowing that there are different things that go on at different times. But one last bonus thing I learned from the event is that there is a definite need and desire for middle grade Christian fantasy and science fiction. I was asked over and over and over and over and over again if I had any middle grade novels for readers between the ages of 9 and 13. I mean, it was like person after person after person asked me. And I did not have anything to offer because most of my novels, even the young adult novels, really are meant for 14 and up. Readers who are younger than 14 read my books, it's true, but I don't normally recommend them to readers under the age of 14. And so I was kind of struck with this, like, whoa, this light bulb moment of, wow, there really is this need for Christian fantasy and sci-fi books for middle grade readers. And I know another author who I stood next to, she and I were both like brainstorming ideas for like, what could we do? Like we're both sitting there thinking, if I wrote a middle grade series, what would that look like? And and we didn't brainstorm really together, but we just talked about how we saw this need, and we were both thinking about what it would take to write a middle grade fantasy or sci-fi book. And then one of the ladies at Embers Ignite Editing, she is writing middle grade fantasy. And so that was kind of cool to talk to her about that. And part of the reason she's writing is because she has already seen this need. But it was something that writer after writer after writer that I talked to who was at the conference noticed that we really needed more middle grade fiction there. I mean, it's this huge conference for fantasy and sci-fi writers. And yet most of the books, I would say 95% of the books, were either for young adult or adult readers. And there were very few books for children or middle grade. And so there's definitely a need for that. And if you feel that you're ready to write a middle grade book, I'd say go for it because, again, there's a huge need for it. So beyond that, beyond the basics that I learned, kind of the generalities that I learned from my time at the expo and manning a booth for 2.5 days, is that I had definitely some personal wins and stumbles. Like I kind of mentioned some of the things within my generalities I talked about. But for me, I was trying to juggle promoting my Kickstarter while also selling my sci-fi and fantasy books. And it didn't work too well. It was really hard to pitch my poetry book when there were books right there to pick up. So, pitching a poetry book that I don't have a physical copy for, while people are like, yes, but I can pick up this sci-fi book right here or this fantasy book over here. I don't want to talk about poetry that you don't have with you. I mean, I had the poem cards, yes, but they were for sale and people just didn't seem to be really interested, and that was hard. And maybe it just wasn't the right event for it too. That might be the case, but it still was, it was a struggle for me. So I'm trying to think about how I could do that at the next event I'll be at in a couple of weeks. How I'm going to make maybe my Kickstarter a little more forward, or at least have a way to pitch it while I'm also pitching my other books. Another thing I noticed was that my sci-fi clearly outshone my fantasy. And my short stories did as well. So I don't know if I had a clearer pitch or what it was, but I had more conversations about my sci-fi books and my short stories. I sold more copies of those books. I didn't come home with very many copies of those books. In fact, Liftoff, the first book in my sci-fi series, I think I came home with only one copy. So, and then I had a couple of copies of the second book and a couple of copies of the short story book left, but all the other ones were gone. Like those sold. My fantasy books did not do as well, but I did still have a few people buy them. So that was nice. And I don't know for sure if it was the price point or I was genuinely doing a better job of pitching those books to potential readers, or if there was so much fantasy at the expo that sci-fi was kind of a rarity. I think it might have been a combination of all three of those things, but there was definitely a trend for me. Next up, one thing I noticed is that the best moments were really genuine conversations and not particularly pitch or sales orientated. In fact, I would say I stumbled really badly a few times while trying to pitch books or talk about my books. And it was actually through laughing at myself and kind of turning the conversation a little bit into more of a conversational tone that helped me as someone at the table. I felt more confident in those conversations, and the people that I had those conversations with, if they didn't buy a book right then, they came back. I had people who came back to my table the second day because they remembered talking to me and they remembered my books. And so that was a huge win for me. So I'm really thankful for that. But it's something to really think about for me, and maybe for other people too, is how to make that moment when you're trying to sell your books. I mean, honestly, you're trying to market your books at a book expo, but at the same time, we want to remember to dig down into being fully, authentically human and meet the need of the human, just that moment of conversation and interaction first. And that kind of reminds me of something that kind of happened while I was there. So I'm from the West Coast of the United States. I've lived in Washington State my whole life. There are things that I say and ways that I speak that are definitely part of growing up in Washington State my whole life. The way that I trail off at the end of my sentences, the way I pronounce some of my R's and some of my vowels. It's all part of living in Washington State my whole life. And some of it's, having hard of hearing parents, having a grandmother with a stroke who lived with us and who I learned to speak with quite a bit when I was younger. So I actually speak a little bit like someone who's been raised by someone with a stroke. I was told that by a speech therapist once. I have all of that kind of going into my speech patterns. Well, when we were in Michigan and Washington, D.C., which I know most people would say are Midwest and not actually East Coast, or middle of the country. Geographically, they're not actually the middle of the country, but it's considered, Midwest area. I think. I could be wrong. If I'm wrong, please correct me. Send me a correction. I'm happy to understand what the geographical terms of the United States are a little bit better, because sometimes they don't make sense to me. Anyway, there's this phrase that I kept hearing, and it was especially when I was at restaurants and stuff like that, when you talk to a waiter and they, ask you questions and you respond, and they'd almost always respond with this one phrase. Now, it's a phrase I hear here in Washington too, but it's not a phrase that I use as often or hear as often as I was hearing in Michigan and in DC. And it's a very simple phrase. It says a lot without saying much, as far as there's not very many words. It's just 3 words, 3 syllables. I got you. One of the waiters at a restaurant my husband and I went to, I think he said, I got you, like probably 20 times by the time we left the restaurant, and just in conversation with us when we were just talking to him and then ordering, and then talking to him again when he came back by the table and checked on us. And every time he asked us a question, we responded, he'd be like, I got you. I got you. And it was interesting because, again, I think that's a pretty normal phrase. It's just not one that I hear as much here in Washington State as I do in Michigan and Washington, D.C. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Just a little random thing right there in the middle of my podcast. It was really not about that. But it is something to kind of think about when we are at an event and we're not in like our home state or the place that we're the most used to. Sometimes we're going to have these different conversational moments. And I know, and maybe it's because of my speech differences that I know I have, that I get kind of concerned about whether or not I'm hearing people correctly or if they're understanding what I'm saying. And so it's always good to kind of give ourselves grace, give the other person grace, be willing to laugh at ourselves if we need to. And that's something that I know, I guess you could say, kind of worked for me. It works for me. I am going to take all that I've learned, and it's going to shape a little bit of how my next event is going to go, although some of it I can't change. Like, I'm not going to change all my book covers or anything like that before I do an event in a week and a half. That's just not going to happen. But I am thinking about how it's going to change events in the future. So in a week and a half, I'll be at the Gig Harbor car show, and I don't write about cars, but I'm going to be selling books at a car show because I was invited to sell books at a car show with other authors. So I'll see how it goes. It'll be a very different crowd, and it'll be in my hometown. So maybe, I won't have to worry about the conversational differences. I might still, who knows? One of the other things that all of this has me thinking about is how I'm going to continue to present my Kickstarter campaign for To Speak. When I love poetry, I've been writing poetry not my whole life, but my whole life since I was 15. I've been writing fantasy and sci-fi from before then, but I've been writing poetry since I was 15. So how can I integrate that into my book talks and book pitches at my author table? I'm still working on that. I'm still thinking about how I'm going to do it. Next episode that I'm going to do here on the podcast is going to be all about To Speak, and I'm actually going to come back on Friday and do a short episode about To Speak and read one of the poems from the collection. And then next week, I plan to do 2 podcasts again and also mainly talk about To Speak, the Kickstarter campaign, the different options there are in it. But I might explore also how my poetry and my fantasy go together, because I noticed something in the first line of one of my fantasy books. So I'll probably read a little bit of that as well as one of my poems on Friday. Until then, consider joining the newsletter. There will be a link in the episode notes. Also, please feel free to check out To Speak, the Kickstarter campaign. Rate and share the podcast from today if today's insights help. And consider sharing this podcast with a friend. It all helps my writing work to grow. My To Speak Kickstarter is live through August 14th, and every pledge, big or small, fuels more content that encourages and equips your own storytelling journey. So thanks for listening, and until next time, keep writing your truth.